Welcome back to our channel. Today we're delving into the extraordinary life of a French entertainer who once held audiences spellbound with his charm, wit, and unmistakable voice. He danced across rooftops in his youth, conquered Parisian stages, Hollywood screens, and even survived the horrors of war. Yet behind that carefree smile and signature straw hat lay secrets, scandals, and struggles with both public perception and private torment. This is the story of Maurice Chevalier, a man who rose from poverty to stardom, loved and lost, battled personal demons, and ultimately faced a terrible death sentence that would test the very core of his legacy. Maurice Chevalier was once known as the ultimate ladies' man. He charmed countless women, seemed to savor every romantic moment, and won over audiences around the globe with his smooth singing voice and signature tilted straw hat. But for all that fame and all those fiery affairs, he ended up brutally alone, left with nothing but his own demons to keep him company. It's hard to imagine that this cheerful French entertainer, who basked in applause and admiration, could have ever done anything so dark and unsettling. But he did something that left deep scars, an act many people would later call unspeakable. Chevalier lived through 2 world wars, an era so unstable that it shaped his entire life and career. Born in 1888, he grew up in a tough situation in Paris. His father had a drinking problem and abandoned the family in 1896, leaving Maurice, who was just 8 at the time, and his brothers to make do however they could. Within a couple of years, his mother's stress levels hit a breaking point. She ended up hospitalized, leaving them all in a fragile state. His eldest brother, Charles, got married and moved out, and while that might have been a relief for Charles, it left Maurice and his younger brother Paul with fewer hands to help. Both boys knew that if their mother was going to recover, they had to pitch in. Paul took a grueling factory job. Maurice dropped out of school before he even turned 11 and chased his dream of becoming an acrobat. In those days, the allure of the stage and circus life was strong. It promised a way out of misery. Maurice was good at it, too, until a painful injury forced him to give it up. After that, he tried to make a living at a mattress factory, but fate seemed bent on breaking him down. A machine crushed his finger, and he was left physically battered yet still determined to keep fighting. It felt like the world was telling him no at every turn. But despite all these cruel setbacks, he still had one gift nobody could take away: his voice. That voice would carry him to places he never dreamed he'd see. He stepped onto stages not only in Paris but also in London and across the United States. He made his mark in silent films and musicals, evolving as entertainment itself evolved. In the early 20th century, he became a symbol of French charm, a man who stood out even among international stars. At one point, people called him the most popular Frenchman in the world. He was famous for his delightful accent, his playful style, and that twinkle in his eye whenever he performed a love song. Audiences adored him. They lined up to see him in cabarets, music halls, and later in Hollywood movies. He worked with major names and crossed paths with legendary performers like Mistinguett, who influenced his style and taught him how to captivate a crowd. But behind that smooth exterior, Chevalier struggled. Despite all the success, he was never truly happy. He faced the torment of personal loss and the pressure of surviving through global conflicts that tested everyone's morals. World War II especially put him in a tight spot. Some say he played a dangerous game, performing under Nazi occupation to maintain his career and to help get French prisoners released. Others argue he had little choice, that he did what he did because he believed it could spare lives. Yet for many, it was unforgivable. This would haunt his reputation for decades. After the war, he fought to clear his name, insisting he never collaborated, but the rumor and the shame clung to him. It's possible this was the unspeakable act hinted at, the stain that he could never fully erase. He returned to the spotlight after the war, but the world had changed. He had changed. He was older, and the old spark of pure joy was harder to find. In many ways, Chevalier's life mirrors the path of a complex anti-hero, rising from poverty, clawing his way into the limelight, winning hearts, then stumbling into moral gray areas during a brutal occupation that tested everyone's principles. He passed through the silent film era, adapted to talkies and musicals, and even reemerged after the war to enchant new generations. He performed in grand revues and even ended up starring in popular Hollywood films, introducing American audiences to a kind of French charm they'd never seen before. He was part of that old world of entertainment where stage performers transformed into movie stars, where love songs seemed to drip with real emotion because the singer had lived through so much hardship. As time wore on, he found himself struggling to hold on to that sense of belonging he once knew so well. His personal demons, memories of childhood hardship, the shame of controversial decisions during the war, the inevitable loneliness that haunts a performer when the crowd stops cheering, stayed with him. While the details of his final years show a man who continued to perform and record songs, he gradually retreated into isolation. It was almost as if the force that drove him to seek love and applause finally drained away. In the end, Maurice Chevalier's voice outlasted his body. His songs still echo across old recordings, showing us that he was more than just a lover or a star. He was a survivor of turbulent times, a performer shaped by both glory and regret. This is the man who once danced on rooftops as an acrobat, who twisted his broken youth into a melody that millions adored, who soared from struggling child to international sensation. Yet beneath that confident smile, he faced inner battles that few knew about. He was a legend who left his mark on music and film, and the full story, with all its warmth and darkness, makes it clear that Maurice Chevalier's life was as complicated and dramatic as any role he ever played on stage or screen. Despite stumbling at the start of his singing career, Maurice Chevalier refused to let early failures define him. It all began when he decided to offer his talents at a small cafe near his home. The owner was hesitant, and honestly, who could blame him? Hiring a 12-year-old singer was a gamble, one that didn't exactly pay off at first. Chevalier sang off-key that night, and the crowd found it more amusing than entertaining. Deeply embarrassed, the young Maurice swore he'd never step on a stage again. But giving up wasn't in his blood. His mother and brother stepped in with some tough love. They reminded him that controlling his nerves would be the key to unlocking his true potential. Encouraged, Maurice went back to the cafe and reinvented himself. This time, he introduced his act as Little Chevalier, the miniature comic. He put on a playful show packed with lively gestures, cheeky jokes, and lighthearted humor. It worked wonders with the general music hall crowd, making them laugh and clap along. True, the more fashionable folks in the audience weren't as thrilled. Maybe they found his humor a bit too rough around the edges, but that didn't matter. For the first time, Maurice got a taste of real success. He learned that pleasing everyone wasn't necessary. It was enough to find his own style and run with it. As he grew older, Maurice began to realize he had more going for him than just a half-decent voice. He was a good-looking kid, and he figured out how to turn that into an advantage. He tweaked his style, refined his presence on stage, and gradually blossomed into a charming young man. Audiences loved that suave side of him, and as his career in France picked up speed, he earned a growing number of admirers who were happy to overlook a few off-key notes if it meant watching him flash that confident grin. One particular performance in Marseille proved to be a breakthrough. He gave it his all and dazzled the crowd. Better yet, among the spectators that night was a major French star, arguably one of the biggest of her era, who saw something special in this up-and-comer. Historians often credit the legendary singer and actress Miss Dinguet as the star who propelled Chevalier's name into the limelight. She recognized his potential and helped introduce him to a wider audience, guiding him into the world of top-tier entertainment. Under her influence, Chevalier's style sharpened, his stage presence matured, and his confidence soared to new heights. It was a turning point, not just in his career, but in the shape of French entertainment at the time. Armed with a newfound sophistication, Chevalier was no longer just that kid from a rough Parisian neighborhood. He was on his way to becoming a genuine star. He'd learned to smooth out the rough edges while keeping that original spark that made him stand out in the first place. From humble beginnings in a tiny café to catching the eye of France's biggest talent, Chevalier's journey was only just getting started. He was proving step by step that even when you fail spectacularly, if you pick yourself up and try again, you might just find your true calling waiting on the other side of embarrassment. After 2 years in the spotlight together, Maurice decided it was time to leave Frehel behind. Frehel, a wildly famous French singer known for her powerful voice and emotional delivery, was also notorious for her vices. Heavy drinking and drug use were everyday parts of her life. Chevalier later claimed that, while he was with Frehel, he fell into addiction as well. Did he walk away to free himself from these dangerous habits? Or was he already gazing at someone more captivating on the horizon? Maybe it was both. It turned out that Maurice had his eye on another star of the Parisian stage, Miss Dinguet. This legendary performer, born Jeanne Florentine Bourgeois, was considered one of the most stunning and talked about women in France at the time. She was charming, cheeky, and known for dominating the top stages of Paris, especially the Folies Bergère and the Moulin Rouge, where she earned a reputation as the highest-paid female entertainer in the world. To Maurice's amazement, the feeling was mutual. Miss Dinguet, who was about a decade older than him, saw something in the young upstart. She wasn't exactly blown away by his singing voice or his dancing ability. If anything, he was still pretty rough around the edges. But he had an undeniable magnetism, a natural warmth and charisma that audiences seemed to love. So this glamorous and scandalous figure took the young Chevalier under her wing. She recognized that if Maurice was going to stand out in a highly competitive scene, he needed polish. She worked tirelessly with him to improve his stage presence, sharpen his mannerisms, and refine his performance style. Their routines became famously energetic and daring. Picture them leaping onto tables, flipping and cartwheeling across the stage, and even ending the act by rolling up together inside a carpet. Such stunts weren't just for shock value. They taught Maurice how to command attention, move with confidence, and make even outrageous tricks look effortless. Miss Dinguet's influence was massive. Her decision to partner only with Chevalier signaled to the public that he was special, someone worth watching. When a star of her caliber insisted on keeping him by her side, it sent a clear message. There must be something extraordinary about this young performer. Under her careful guidance, Maurice's career took off in ways he'd never imagined. He was no longer just a struggling talent trying to break free from his old addictions and humble roots. He was on the fast track to becoming a major figure in the French entertainment world. But unfortunately for him, this new chapter was just the start of a much more complicated journey. The streets of Paris were filled with gossip. The world wars were looming on the horizon, and the pressures of stardom, both on and off stage, would soon test Maurice's character and choices in ways he never saw coming. He barely got a chance to savor his growing fame before life threw him a major curveball. When World War I broke out, Maurice was called up to serve his country. Leaving the bright lights and cheers of the stage behind wasn't easy, and it broke Mistinguet's heart to see him go, but there was nothing either of them could do. Maurice, never one to run from responsibility, ended up right on the front lines. It didn't take long before disaster struck. During a fierce battle, a piece of shrapnel ripped into his back. The injury itself wasn't enough to kill him, but it led to something that nearly derailed his entire future. He was captured by the Germans. Just like that, he went from dazzling Parisian theaters to a cramped prison cell, where he'd spend the next 2 years as a prisoner of war. Conditions in these camps were often grim, with limited food, poor sanitation, and constant uncertainty about what the next day might bring. But Maurice refused to let this nightmare break his spirit. Instead of wasting time on regrets or what-ifs, he decided to do something practical. He started learning English. It might have seemed like an odd choice in the midst of a brutal war, but Maurice had a vision. He believed that mastering English would help him in his career once he got out. He wanted to perform not just for French audiences, but for people around the world, and English was his ticket to a wider stage. Turns out he was right. His language skills would become a big part of what made him an international sensation later on. 2 years is a long time to be locked away, though, and he might have stayed behind bars even longer if not for the behind-the-scenes efforts of his biggest supporter. Mistinguet, back in Paris, still cared deeply about him. She used her influence and connections to try and secure his release. This was no small task during wartime, but if there was anyone who could help, it was the most famous woman on the French stage, and her devotion paid off. Maurice's good looks and undeniable charm had always opened doors for him, and this situation was no different. Nearly every woman who crossed his path felt drawn to him, even if it was just enough to lend a helping hand. Add that to Mistinguet's star power, and Maurice had an advantage few others could claim. Before the war, he'd been on the brink of real stardom, and now, thanks to his adaptability and the fierce loyalty of people like Mistinguet, he had a fighting chance to reclaim what he'd lost. The world was changing, and so was he. As soon as the war ended, he'd return to a France eager for entertainment and hope. Little did he know, his toughest challenges and his greatest triumphs still lay ahead. His departure devastated Mistinguet. She was heartbroken to learn that he'd ended up a prisoner of war, locked away and far from the spotlight they once shared. Determined not to lose him, she turned to an admirer with real influence, the King of Spain. Thanks to her request, he stepped in and pressured the Germans to release Maurice. But if you think it was a simple matter of signing papers and walking out, think again. This rescue mission was as dramatic and complicated as any stage show they'd ever performed. First, Mistinguet raced to meet her beloved, only to be mistaken by the French authorities for the notorious spy Mata Hari. The confusion wasn't entirely random. Both women were glamorous, high-profile figures who moved in elite circles, but it still came as a humiliating delay. Eventually, the French realized their error, cleared her name, and let her go on her way. Yet just as she thought she'd resolved one problem, another popped up. The Germans, who still held Maurice captive, refused to let him go unless Mistinguet agreed to spy toward them. She promised, but only after working out a secret arrangement with the French to double-cross the enemy. It was a risky game, and when the Germans realized what was happening, they were furious. They decided to execute her for her betrayal. Luckily, a last-minute prisoner exchange saved her life. They spared Mistinguet in return for a few German detainees held by the French. After all that intrigue and near-death drama, Mistinguett and Maurice were finally free to reunite. But as Maurice stepped back onto Parisian soil, he discovered a city forever changed by war. The old cheers and carefree laughter had faded. Audiences who had once adored him were now quieter, sadder, and more cautious. After everything he'd been through, the battlefield, the shrapnel wound, captivity, and all that time away, Maurice couldn't just slip back into his old persona. He was different, and so was the world. He struggled to connect with crowds that felt distant and unfamiliar. This could have easily marked the end of Maurice Chevalier's career as an entertainer. After all, how do you pick up where you left off when nothing is the same? But he had Mistinguett on his side. She refused to take no for an answer. Time and again, she demanded that theaters include Maurice on their bills. She insisted that if she were to perform, he'd be right there beside her. With her star power behind him, Maurice began to find his footing again, step by step, show by show. Their joint acts coaxed out a spark of the old magic. The audience remembered what they loved about him, the charm, the humor, the effortless presence. And he started remembering too. Soon enough, Maurice Chevalier wouldn't just return to his former glory. He would soar far beyond it, proving that even after war and heartbreak, after misunderstanding and political games, a true entertainer could still make people smile again. And Mistinguett, the fearless and cunning force who rescued him not only from captivity, but from his own doubts, made sure the world would never forget it. Maurice found his footing once again, and as his confidence returned, audiences fell in love with him all over. He began exploring new sounds like jazz and ragtime, both of which were crossing the Atlantic and sweeping through Europe in the wake of the Great War. Chevalier realized that performing internationally, touring places like London and the United States, could offer him a chance to broaden his horizons and his fan base. He had grown more ambitious, more daring, and eager to leave his war-torn past behind and embrace a world hungry for fresh entertainment. Meanwhile, Mistinguett, who had risked her life to save him and fostered his stardom, found herself watching Maurice drift away. Even though she had been deeply in love, some said he was the great passion of her life. His devotion to her had begun to fade. By 1918, as the dust of war settled and Paris tried to rediscover its joie de vivre, he turned his attention to another actress, Léonie Battiat, known to the world as Arletty. Arletty would later become a famed star of French cinema, remembered for her roles in classics like Les Enfants du Paradis. At that time, though, she was just another blossoming talent catching Maurice's eye. Mistinguett was heartbroken, especially considering how she'd paved his way back to the spotlight. With his heart set on international acclaim, Maurice jumped at an offer to perform at the Palace Theatre in London. His English lessons from those grim days in a German prison cell were finally paying off. Unlike many other French entertainers of the day, he could banter easily with English-speaking audiences, tossing out playful remarks and flirty winks that made crowds roar with laughter. These small interactions worked wonders. He was no longer just another foreign singer. He was becoming a charming, relatable personality that audiences could connect with. In London, something else caught his eye, a simple straw hat popular among the city's well-dressed men. It might sound like a small detail, but this hat would soon become a signature part of his image, a visual calling card that audiences would recognize instantly. He wore it at a rakish angle, pairing it with that effortless grin, and before long, the straw hat would help define the Maurice Chevalier look. He was transforming into the polished showman who would one day become famous worldwide, not just for his voice, but for his style, humor, and undeniable flair. Maurice decided he just had to have one of those straw boaters for himself, and from the moment he put it on, it became part of his signature look. Even years later, when the hat went out of style, nobody could imagine him without that iconic straw boater and a sharp tuxedo. This polished, instantly recognizable image helped him transition from the stage to the screen once he returned to Paris. He started appearing in his first films, eager to prove he could shine not just under theater lights, but in front of the camera too. Then came an opportunity he almost passed on, an operetta called Dédé. At first, Maurice considered skipping it, maybe thinking he had better things lined up, but something told him to give it a try, and thank goodness he did. Dédé became one of his biggest hits, a true career changer. Even more exciting, it grabbed the attention of two heavyweight American composers, George Gershwin and Irving Berlin, who were busy shaping the sound of Broadway. They saw star quality in Maurice and decided to bring the show to the United States, with Chevalier himself in the starring role. It was a huge deal. Maurice had already conquered European stages, so now he'd get the chance to test his talent across the Atlantic in front of a whole new crowd. Deep down, Chevalier knew he didn't have the world's greatest singing voice. He freely admitted it. But he was smart enough to know that if he couldn't blow people away with vocal power alone, he'd need a unique style to stand out. That's when he hit on something fresh. He started half talking and half singing his songs, weaving playful banter and spoken lines into the music. It might sound strange, but the audiences loved it. They saw him less as just another singer and more as a one-of-a-kind entertainer with charm to spare. The approach worked wonders in France and soon enough in America. The man in the straw boater hat had found a winning formula. Still, even though Dédé was a success in the U.S., Maurice didn't land any other immediate roles there. Hollywood hadn't yet come knocking, and Broadway producers beyond that show weren't handing him offers. Feeling a bit let down, he returned to Paris. The city was still recovering from the war, and its entertainment scene was shifting as people craved something new. Maurice started working on a French revue, basically a big variety show, to keep his career moving forward. During auditions for dancers, as he searched for fresh talent and a spark of new energy that could carry him into the future, he found himself at another turning point. He had already navigated massive changes: 2 world wars, prison camps, heartbreak, lost loves, and bold career moves that took him from the cafés of Paris to the grand stages of London, and eventually Broadway. Now, as he stood in that audition hall, he was looking for something that would set the next chapter of his life in motion, something that would keep the applause coming and the spotlight shining on the man who knew how to turn even his shortcomings into unforgettable charm. It was around this time that Maurice crossed paths with someone who would briefly make him forget all the hardship and heartbreak he'd endured. Her name was Yvonne Vallée. Petite, dark-haired, and famously shy, she seemed like a quiet presence in a world dominated by towering personalities and booming voices. Something about her caught Maurice's eye immediately. He announced on the spot that she'd be his new dance partner. Before long, she evolved from a graceful performer by his side into a romantic partner in his private life. They grew closer, and after a spell of excitement and hope, Maurice found himself so smitten that he proposed. They were married for about 8 years, often performing together on stage, an elegant, dazzling duo who seemed, at least to outsiders, perfectly matched. But as anyone who'd followed Maurice's life so far could guess, glittering appearances didn't always reflect inner harmony. Despite dancing and singing side by side, the marriage didn't last. The entertainment world was a place of constant change and relentless demands, and not every relationship survived under those hot spotlights. It was a painful realization for both, especially for Yvonne, who had witnessed Maurice rise to ever greater heights just as their personal connection began to unravel. By the late 1920s, sound had arrived in Hollywood, transforming the film industry practically overnight. Maurice made his American debut in the 1928 film Innocents of Paris, where audiences got to hear that charming French accent and see his comedic timing up close. He quickly landed a contract with Paramount Pictures. Soon after, he earned something that even many Hollywood veterans never achieved: recognition from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. He snagged 2 Best Actor nominations for The Love Parade, 1929, and The Big Pond, 1930. Consider how far he'd come. He'd been a boy who once tried and failed to be an acrobat, who crushed his hand in a factory machine, who barely scraped by singing in a cafe. Now he stood shoulder to shoulder with the top names in American cinema. He didn't just conquer the silver screen either. Maurice found success in the American music scene, recording songs that soared in popularity and spread his fame even further. Here was a French performer who once struggled to keep an audience's attention in his hometown, now charming listeners in foreign lands who didn't even share his native language. He was proof that charisma could cross borders, that a clever mix of talk, singing, and personality could win over people from any culture. When Maurice arrived in Hollywood, interest in musicals had started to fade. American audiences had fallen head over heels for sound pictures, but many were already over the old-fashioned razzle-dazzle of big song and dance productions. Yet Maurice wasn't one to bow to what was in or out. Trends didn't scare him. He'd reinvented himself before and wasn't afraid to do it again. He knew that if he was going to stand out, he'd have to rely on more than just a strong script or a catchy tune. He had to deliver something unique, a flavor that was distinctly Maurice Chevalier. Over the coming years, he would prove that the right combination of wit, style, and charm could transcend any passing fad. Maurice Chevalier refused to follow Hollywood's changing tastes. At a time when American audiences were losing interest in musicals, he went ahead and starred in The Smiling Lieutenant in 1931. Instead of flopping, it became a hit, proving that his brand of charm and wit could still pack theaters. This wasn't just a lucky break either. Although he was well into middle age, Chevalier's rise in America was far from over. Any lingering doubts Paramount had about casting him in musicals quickly vanished. His next film, 1 Hour with You, turned out to be such a success that the public wanted even more. That same year, the studio released Love Me Tonight, pairing him again with Jeanette MacDonald. In just a few short years, the scrawny kid who once languished in a German POW camp had become a full-blown Hollywood star. But as his fame soared, some darker aspects of his personality began to emerge. The endless attention from adoring female fans had inflated his ego, making him quick to anger when faced with rejection. He and MacDonald clashed off camera. She rejected his advances, and he called her a prude. She, in turn, branded him the quickest derriere pincher in Hollywood. It didn't exactly help that Maurice was feeling restless. After a brief stint with MGM, the magic of Hollywood began to wear thin, and he decided it was time to pack his bags and head back to France. He'd proven what he set out to prove in the States, and now he craved home again. His first marriage hadn't gone the distance, but that didn't mean he was ready to give up on love or the idea of marriage altogether. Far from it. He still believed in romance. After all, the heart of a true entertainer isn't easily discouraged. He'd been through countless highs and lows, war, heartbreak, prison camps, cultural barriers, and now this taste of American stardom. Nothing had stopped him before, and he wasn't about to let a disappointing Hollywood chapter or a messy relationship define his future. It was time to return to Europe, reinvent himself yet again, and find new ways to delight the audiences who had supported him for so long. In 1937, Maurice married a dancer named Nita Raya. She was Jewish, and as the Germans began invading France, he realized that staying in Paris would put her and her family at grave risk. He relocated everyone to the so-called Free Zone in southern France, hoping the Nazis would leave them alone there. But escaping to the unoccupied area didn't mean the Germans would ignore him altogether. His fame worked against him. German officials wanted him to perform in Berlin. Maurice refused, blaming his health, but they were not the kind of people who took no lightly. Before long, they started making spine-chilling threats against his wife and her family. He knew that he couldn't refuse forever if he wanted to keep them safe. Eventually, he agreed to a performance at a German-controlled camp. In a dark twist of fate, the show took place in the very location where he'd once been a prisoner himself during the First World War. Still, Maurice wasn't about to perform without using this opportunity to help others. He demanded that the Germans release 10 French prisoners of war in exchange for his appearance. Remarkably, they agreed. But instead of becoming a heroic figure in the public eye, Maurice found himself labeled a traitor. The media twisted the story, painting him as someone who willingly performed for the Nazis and didn't care about suffering French citizens. Suddenly he was caught in an impossible trap. The Germans could still use his family against him, while some in the French resistance viewed him as an enemy. He had few options left. After ensuring his wife and her family were safely hidden away, Maurice went underground himself. Even when France was liberated in 1944, the trouble didn't end. French authorities arrested him on charges of collaboration, a crime that carried the death penalty. He managed to get a message out to his secretary, who passed it on to a reporter dedicated to unearthing the truth. Once the facts came to light, the French government realized they'd made a dreadful mistake. Embarrassed by the misunderstanding, they released him, and Maurice regained much of his former glory in France. The United States, however, wasn't as quick to forgive and forget. Initially, they denied him a visa because of the wartime rumors. Later, they continued to block his entry because he had signed the Stockholm Appeal, a peace petition calling for a ban on nuclear weapons, an action viewed with deep suspicion in an era of anti-communist fervor. Only after the McCarthy era ended was Maurice welcomed back to America. He returned to Hollywood as if he'd never left, launching a spectacular comeback in 1955. His first film after that 20-year gap was Billy Wilder's Love in the Afternoon, starring Audrey Hepburn and Gary Cooper. The old French charmer hadn't lost his touch. Audiences were delighted, and critics praised his effortless style. Then came Gigi in 1958, a movie that would become one of his most famous works and earn him an honorary Oscar for his lifetime achievements. He journeyed all the way from a troubled boyhood in Paris to a global star, honored at the Academy Awards. Yet for all his success and the fortune he amassed over the years, Maurice was known to be tight with his money. Friends, colleagues, and business associates would often whisper about just how reluctant he was to let go of a franc. It was a curious trait for a man whose life had been so public, glamorous, and full of sweeping adventures. But then again, Chevalier was always full of surprises. Maurice once admitted he guarded his money so closely because poverty, in his words, was a disease that can never be cured. Despite his frugality, in 1952, he purchased a large property near Paris, naming it La Luc in honor of his mother. Perhaps as the years passed, he felt her absence even more. Around a decade after marrying Nita Raya, his second marriage fell apart. Without steady companionship outside of work, when he wasn't performing or indulging in brief flings with chorus girls, he led a surprisingly lonely life. This solitude may have pushed him to keep working as long as he did, even as he grew older, sometimes making choices that weren't always in his best interest. During the 1960s, Maurice toured extensively, traveling through the United States, across Europe, and returning again to Los Angeles. Stubbornly clinging to the spotlight he'd fought so hard to claim. By the late 60s, he decided to call it quits. In 1968, he announced a farewell tour and official retirement, which many assume would be the final curtain on a storied career spanning decades and continents. Yet 2 years later, Disney approached him to sing the title song for The Aristocats, 1970, the last film Walt Disney personally approved before his death. Maurice agreed, lending his instantly recognizable voice to a new generation. This charming performance, full of the old warmth and playfulness, would become his final contribution to the industry. It was a gentle, nostalgic nod to the past in a changing entertainment landscape, where European stars, American audiences, and global tastes had all shifted dramatically since his early days. Throughout his career, he had witnessed the silent era give way to talkies, the rise and fall of the Hollywood musical, and the global spread of jazz and popular song. He had performed alongside major names, influenced styles on both sides of the Atlantic, and introduced a distinctly French flair to audiences far beyond Paris. Tragically, the next time Maurice Chevalier made headlines, it was for a reason that shook those who remembered him as a smiling, debonair figure. In March 1971, he attempted to take his own life. His long battle with depression, which had surfaced in varying degrees over many years, reached a breaking point. He overdosed on barbiturates, surviving the immediate crisis but suffering severe health consequences. The months that followed were marked by relentless struggles: liver damage, kidney failure, memory lapses, and fatigue that refused to fade. Doctors tried dialysis, and when that failed, resorted to kidney surgery in a desperate final attempt. In January 1972, Chevalier's heart gave out and he passed away. He was buried beside his mother, the woman whose name adorned his beloved French property and whose memory had stayed with him through every twist of fate. His funeral, quiet and intimate, included only close family and dear friends, an understated farewell for a man who had once been greeted by thunderous applause and had sung for millions around the globe. In the end, though he'd lived large and rubbed shoulders with icons, only a few truly stood beside him as he was laid to rest. His story remains a complex tapestry of triumph and trouble, love and loss, resilience and regret, an unforgettable journey from the streets of Paris to the grand stages of the world. In the end, Maurice Chevalier's life played out like one of his most dramatic performances, a blend of applause and whispers, triumph and tragedy, devotion and betrayal. He brought joy to millions, yet carried wounds that never fully healed. His story endures as a cautionary tale, a reminder that behind every stage persona lies a human being shaped by struggle, choice, and consequence.